Good evening and welcome to another fun-filled evening of Zoom C4 Zoom style. We will start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Oh,
I think Trent, you're throwing up a
there we go.
perfect, sir. Wonderful. I pledge allegiance to
Flag
the flag
of the United States of America,
and to the
to the
republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate that. We do that. I think we'll do welcome and introductions. We'll keep the introductions light. I think everyone's got their names up. We have a whole slew of participants there. Thank you all for being here. The agenda will be, I think, good this evening. I think we'll have a lot of good conversation. So we'll move quickly into taking care of the minutes from the last meeting. Do you have a motion on that at all?
So moved to accept the minutes of the last meeting.
Second.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tammy. Any discussion, changes? No? All those in favor?
Aye.
Seeing lots of hands in affirmation that that's good to go. Perfect.
Aye.
Perfect. Ayes have it. House Bill 2001 rulemaking updates. Do we have Mr. Stuckmeyer on with us to present?
Yes, I am here.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everybody for allowing me to kind of give an update on House Bill 2001 today. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the Senior Housing Planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I am helping lead the implementation of both House Bill 2001 and 2003, House Bill 2003, both of which were passed in the 2019 legislative session. Trent, I don't know if I have the ability to share my screen at all.
You have
Okay.
You have the wheel.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to put up a couple documents here. I think, Trent, you were able to get these sent out beforehand, but really what I want to focus on today is just talking about really I think the basics of House Bill 2001 and how the department is kind of really focusing on implementing that bill. We're in the midst of the rulemaking phase at the moment. Provide you a little bit of updates on where the rulemaking started, where we went, kind of where we're kind of heading now. We're in about I would say, the 2-minute warning of the fourth quarter of rulemaking. And so we're kind of coming down to an end and, want to just kind of provide as much information as I can to you all, the folks who will actually be implementing it in your jurisdiction. So I think today will be a really informal type presentation. Feel free to interrupt, interject, ask questions, provide comments, as I kind of go along here. It's, it's a very complicated bill, and there's lots of different policy decisions that were made throughout the process. And so we want to just kind of, make sure everybody is abundantly clear on, the very, very nitty gritty kind of specifics of the bill. So I guess with that, I'll kind of start out by just describing what House Bill 2001 is and what it does. So House Bill 2001, if you're not familiar, is kind of the middle housing bill. You might have heard it referred to as a prohibition on exclusionary single-family zoning in the state of Oregon. What it does is expands housing choice in medium and large cities across the state of Oregon. And so there's there's a separation point between cities, and that's what you see on your screen here. The triangles, those are medium-sized cities. Those are cities outside of the Portland metro boundary with a population between 10,000 and 25,000. Those cities are kind of on the hook for allowing duplexes on every lot and parcel that's zoned residentially and that allow for the development of a detached single-family home. That's different from the large and metro cities and metro counties. The requirement for those cities is the same for duplexes, a duplex on every lot and parcel. But those large and metro cities, those cities outside of the Portland metro boundary over the population 25,000, and then inside the Portland metro boundary, cities over 1,000 population. So even though the city is 1,000 population, it's still defined as a large city. And then portions of unincorporated Washington, Clackamas, and Multnomah counties that are within the Portland UGB and that also have urban services. So those areas are required to allow a duplex on every lot and parcel, very similar to medium-sized cities. They're also required to allow higher level middle housing types, and those are triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters in areas that are zoned residentially and that allow for the development of a single-family detached home. So one of the key considerations in our rulemaking process is, well, what the heck does an area mean, and how is that different than every lot and parcel? You know, we know for a fact that it is different than every lot and parcel, but what does that actually mean as we're going through and writing rules related to that language, that phrase? And so that's one of the major, like I said, one of the major considerations of the rulemaking process. We've had at this point 9 rulemaking advisory committee meetings. I have lost track of the amount of technical advisory committee meetings that we've also had kind of supplement the rulemaking process. This group, the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and the Technical Advisory Committees, are made up of various land use planners, elected officials, stakeholders, housing advocates, kind of runs the gamut of people who have a vested interest in the implementation of House Bill 2001 and House Bill 2003. There's a couple folks from Clackamas County, Martha Fritzie, who I think is kind of listening in to this meeting. So hi, Martha. I think there was about a total of 60 folks on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, both primaries and alternates. So lots of people at the table, which was really a benefit for our rulemaking process. So I think we came out with a pretty good product that it really works the best that we can make it. So for the medium-sized cities, the deadline for adopting local codes that are compliant with House Bill 2001 is June 30th of 2021. So those cities would need to come up with siting and design standards that allow for the development of duplexes by that date, or they would be subject to a model code that the department and the Rulemaking Advisory Committee has developed. And so as we're going through reviewing those codes, those development codes at the local level, the city can either choose to adopt the model code, which is a very specific set of standards. You know, you think of it as just a normal development code, 25 feet for a maximum building height, and there's no real range within there. It's a very specific set of standards. And then as the department reviews, the Department of Land Conservation and Development is the review body for, you know, post-acknowledgement plan amendments, which is really just an update of a city's development codes and comprehensive plan and so on and so forth. The department needs to have a list of kind of basic minimum compliance standards to ensure that a city's regulating middle housing in a way that does not cause unreasonable cost and delay to that development. So we've got kind of a two-track system as you're kind of figuring out. You've got the model code, which is one very specific set of standards, and then the minimum compliance standards, which are really like a range of options that provide flexibility to the city to say, look, the model code just really isn't going to work for us. There are specific standards in the model code that we just don't feel are going to be appropriate for our local context. And so we're going to go some other route, but the department needs to put a kind of minimum and a maximum on those standards to ensure that cities are still complying with the intent of House Bill 2001. So we've adopted those minimum compliance standards and the model code for the medium-sized cities. Because their deadline is so quick, it's June 30th of 2021, so it's coming up very quickly. So we wanted to kind of front load that work in the beginning of the rulemaking process. We've adopted those rules at the end of July, and they were made effective July 27th, if I am remembering correctly. For large and metro cities, the deadline for adopting locally compliant codes is a year later, June 30th of 2022. So they have an additional year to adopt those codes, mostly because they're dealing with more middle housing types, some more complex issues. So the legislature granted those cities a little bit more time. And so we're kind of holding off on, we're focusing on the medium cities rules and then focusing on the large and metro cities rules. So those rules is what we're kind of in the process of adopting currently. Our commission, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, meets every other month. They have a meeting in September, on the 25th of September. That's going to be their first hearing of the large and metro cities rules, both the minimum compliance standards and the model code for middle housing. They'll hold open that public hearing for just about 2 months until November 12th or 12th and 13th. They have a 2-day meeting in November, and they will hopefully adopt those rules at their November meeting. And part of the reason why it's a sequential event like that, where they have the public hearing in one meeting and then adopt later, is because we know that we're not going to get the rules right on the first try. So we want the commission input on what's working, what's not working, and then of course having the public comment period also helps us kind of right size those rules and refine them a little bit. And then there's another piece there. The department is required to adopt both the model code and those minimum compliance standards by December 31st of 2020. So that was a lot of information, a lot of dates, and we'll get into the specifics about the actual implementation and the rules in just a second. But I wanted to pause there and see if there's any questions about all of that information that I just provided you.
I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other, and I'll help
Thank
with
you.
the questions as the hands go up. When they go up.
When or if.
There were a lot of questions leading into this meeting, so I suspect they will come.
Okay. And maybe it's just getting warmed up, maybe. All right. So I guess if there's no questions, I'll move on mostly into the medium-sized cities. I do appreciate that there's folks' names. Names have their affiliations, so I know that I should speak to both the medium cities and the large cities. So I appreciate that. So I'll touch on both, and I'll try to keep them fairly quick and easy to digest, but again, very, very detailed, lots of nuance. Stop me at any time. So I'll jump into the medium-sized cities, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a different document, and you also received this document as part of your packet. Hopefully this looks familiar. So I kind of talked about the requirements and the timelines and the significant pieces of House Bill 2001 already in kind of that preamble. But the medium-sized cities rules are, for lack of a better term, pretty cut and dry as compared to the large and metro cities. A duplex on every lot and parcel that's zoned residential and allows for a detached single-family dwelling. There's no real kind of wiggle room or policy decisions that really need to be made there on a statewide rulemaking effort. There's certainly policy decisions that need to be made at the local level, but not really in a rulemaking, from a rulemaking perspective. So there's kind of 6 or so major points on the medium cities rules. Primary among them, of course, is the unreasonable cost and delay. Cities are allowed to regulate the siting and design standards of middle housing so long as they do not individually or cumulatively cause unreasonable cost and delay to the development of middle housing. So what does that mean? How do we approach those standards? And really what the rulemaking advisory committee and the department staff really kind of landed on is we're really going to tie those standards to the development standards that apply to a single family detached home in the same zone. So if a standard is applied to a duplex that is, let's say, more restrictive, I like to use building height as a perfect example. So if a single family detached home can go up to 25 feet, and that's the existing standard, if a city then applies a maximum building height to a duplex that's 20 feet and that's more restrictive than what's allowed to single family detached home, we would qualify that as unreasonable, an unreasonable cost or delay to the development of middle housing. And therefore we would say that that standard is not in compliance with our minimum compliance standards or the intent of House Bill 2001. So what we've done for the most part is really tied those development standards, those siting and design standards for duplexes to the development standards that basically already exist for single family detached homes in the same zone. You can think about those in kind of the same neighborhood. You know, we're really looking at creating a structure where duplexes are looking the same building height, same kind of bulk and scale as the existing single family detached homes in existing neighborhoods to kind of lighten the blow a little bit. So is that somebody?
I was going to say, if this is a transfer or a transition point, I do have a hand on something that maybe you just spoke about. So that would be Paul Gornick.
Hey, Paul, I think you might be muted.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm from a local sanitation district, and my question is related to system development charges. I can see the development community starting to push back on developing at a higher density as meriting smaller system development charges. DLCD doesn't intend to address that through any of their model language. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's outside of the scope of what we're looking at. We're looking at siting and design standards specifically.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, great question. All right. So I think that's actually a pretty good transition into the next couple pieces here. So another kind of key sticking point in the medium cities rulemaking process was parking. That was the most talked about standard for this set of rules. What was the right parking standard? You know, should we have a parking standard? And ultimately what we landed on is, after a lot of kind of discussion and research about perceived and real vehicle ownership across the state of Oregon, is that in the model code, we said cities cannot apply parking standards to duplexes. Very hard and fast rule, very specific. And then in the model code, or I'm sorry, in the minimum compliance standards, if a city really doesn't like that standard, we heard quite a bit from local governments that that standard just really isn't going to work. In the minimum compliance standards, we basically said a city cannot require more than one off-street parking space per unit in a duplex. So 2 parking spaces total. But that doesn't say anything about how many parking spaces a city can allow in that development. So it's very nuanced language there, very important to understand the difference between those two. So we've kind of put a maximum to kind of describe it in funky terms. But so a city can then choose to say, we're going to require no off-street parking spaces, 1 off-street parking space for the entire duplex, or 2, and those are the options. And then if a developer comes in and says, look, we're going to build bigger duplex units, 3-bedroom, 2 3-bedroom units, and we really feel that we need 3 off-street parking spaces per unit, and so we're going to have a total of 6, then the city can certainly say, yeah, that sounds great, but we cannot require more than 2. So that's kind of the situation that would arise and how that would be implemented at the local level there. And the other one was just how we defined a duplex, whether we should define it as just 2 units on a lot and not say anything about the configuration, whether they should be attached or detached, and how that plays into a single family home with an ADU and what are the implications of that. And ultimately what we landed on in the minimum compliance standards is saying a city should at least, right, allow for or define a duplex as 2 attached units on a lot. However, they can choose if they want to define a duplex as any 2 units on a lot. And then in a situation where that might end up looking like a single family home with an ADU, the property owner would have at the time of the permit submittal to kind of elect which one they would, how they want to designate that development. Of course, that has system development charge implications, that has setback implications, that has occupancy and parking implications, but ultimately that'll be up to the property owner to decide how they will designate that. So that's a really quick kind of top 3 points for the medium cities rules. Any questions on those from Canby or Sandy or any others, folks?
Actually, I have one from the county, Commissioner Savas.
Great.
Yeah, my questions regarding I just in my head replaying back the wording that you had, which is not a secret, but so when we say that X amount of lots or X amount of units on a lot of record, obviously, that really means that the ownership opportunities are really to that lot of record and not to, let's say, a fourplex, right? So you could have a single family home with a fourplex on it, and really there's not for a majority of those residents in those units, there's really not any individual home ownership opportunities, are there?
So that point has come up again and again in the rulemaking process, and I think Martha certainly knows that the issue with kind of fee simple ownership of lots and condoization of those is really kind of preventing a huge barrier to home ownership opportunities, especially within the confines of middle housing. And we've heard quite a bit that there needs to be something to change there to really kind of boost the home ownership opportunities that middle housing could provide. But really at the end of the day, any kind of changes to platting standards, lot configurations, condoization rules, liabilities, all of that kind of stuff needs to come from the Oregon legislature. That would be a legislative fix to make it work the best. So we're certainly aware of that issue, but yeah, unfortunately we don't have a whole lot of leeway there or even authority to make that work better.
No other questions at this time.
Great. All right. So like I mentioned, kind of at the top, we've got those medium cities rules adopted already. And those are effective. We've got a bunch of technical assistance grants to cities all over the state who are beginning the implementation of those rules and complying with the new rules, which I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, were adopted. If you're interested at all in reviewing the specific rule language, those are in Oregon Administrative Rule Chapter 660, Division 46, which is a new division in DLCD's Oregon Administrative Rules Chapter 660. All right, so I'm going to move on to the large and metro cities. This is a quite the beast compared to medium cities, mostly just because of the complexity. We're looking at writing statewide rules for multiple housing types, for multiple different types of cities in all sorts of different situations across the state. So you can imagine the difficulty to write a consistent, concise, implementable, operationable set of standards for all of that. So I just want to kind of provide that disclaimer at the top. We know that there's quite a bit of work still remaining to be done, even though we've got our public hearing in September in just a couple weeks. And I have to apologize to the group. When Trent and I were setting up this meeting and getting the information to you, it was maybe 2 or 3 days prior to when the rules were actually publicized. And so I would have sent them over, but They weren't quite ready for the public viewing. They have now been published and are ready to review. Those were actually published through the Secretary of State on September 1st. So if you're interested in kind of digging through, and I actually have a copy of them that I'm going to switch my screen to here. That'll be kind of it's going to be, unfortunately, probably a little bit confusing, but I think it'll help in the long run here. So this is kind of the draft version of the proposed rules for, again, Division 46 in OAR 660, Oregon Administrative Rules, Chapter 660. It's got, I think we've got 13 pages of rules here. Part of this is the medium cities rules, and part of this is just rules applicable to both medium-sized cities and large and metro cities and counties. So lots here. I'm just going to kind of scroll through, so shield your eyes a little bit here. Scrolling through all of these standards, we'll stop a little bit in the definitions just to kind of show how we're kind of structuring this a little bit. So as you'll see through all of these rules, we provide a lot of different options for cities. We say, for duplex is a good example. We say a duplex means 2 attached dwelling units on a lot and parcel. However, a local government may choose to define it differently if they want to. And so you'll see a lot of that kind of language where we take a stance, and here's kind of the preferred method, but there are kind of off ramps and options available to local governments. Kind of just a little bit of a nuance here. The large city definition includes the county areas. So Clackamas County folks, don't think that we forgot about you. We just kind of lumped you into the large city definition, so we didn't have to say large city and metro city and counties every time. So you're still in there. Let's see. So I'm going to kind of scroll through to compliance, which, like I mentioned before, and I did it a little bit in passing, and I apologize. I knew that I was going to get to it in more detail here. The model code is both a kind of guiding document, which provides a good set of standards to local jurisdictions as they're going through their local adoption process. It's, like I said, a very kind of, it's a best practice heavy. We took the word model code to heart, and it's really kind of the model, the ideal set of standards to regulate middle housing. And sometimes that is not going to be palatable to local governments. We know that. So it's got that kind of guiding principle, but it's also got a second purpose, and that's more of a enforcement mechanism. So if a city has not adopted a compliant set of standards to regulate middle housing by the specific deadlines, again, reminder, medium cities, that's June 30th of 2021. For larger metro cities, that's June 30th of 2022. If they haven't basically complied with the Division 46 here by that timeline, the model code applies directly to any development applications that come in. For medium cities, that would be a duplex. For large and metro cities, that would be any other middle housing types. So there's certainly a kind of carrot incentive there for cities to adopt compliant codes, especially cities who may not like the standards that are in the model code itself. So for medium cities, it's pretty easy. The duplex standards that exist on the books in that medium city would be completely kind of preempted by the model code. But for large and metro cities, what happens if a city is compliant in 95% of the standards, but then in one townhome standard, they just didn't quite get there, or they're not willing to budge? Does the entire model code apply, even for duplexes, even for triplexes, even though their standards are compliant? And that certainly posed an issue. So what we've done is really segmented out the model code for large and metro cities. We're showing, in a situation where a city, like I mentioned, just is fully compliant except for 1 or 2 standards in the townhome section, only the townhome model code would apply to that city, and then they would be able to apply their own triplex, duplex, so on and so forth standards. So a little bit of kind of nuance there, which I think is important, especially when city planners and elected officials are kind of going through the final adoption process, understanding what the enforcement and compliance requirements are. Okay, again, kind of apologize for the headache-inducing scrolling here. These are the standards applicable to medium cities. We kind of call this the 100 section. And I'm going to scroll right past that. I described it in enough detail as we really need to get into today. But then we kind of arrive at the 200 section, which is the standards applicable to the large cities. And I think section 205 here is really the most consequential section. This is where we get into defining the in areas question, where we kind of put a fine point on what that means, what are the options available to these large and metro cities and counties, and how we anticipate going about that process. So basically, when we first started trying to determine what in areas meant, we basically kind of determined that pretty much every option really falls into two basic categories. Either a presumptive approach, where you're saying middle housing is basically allowed everywhere that a duplex is allowed, kind of the all lots and parcels approach. And we know that the language in House Bill 2001 didn't go that far. So we also couldn't go that far, and because we wouldn't be compliant with House Bill 2001. The other approach is kind of, you start from zero and you add to it approach. So this would be the approach that we've kind of coined the balloon approach, where you would allow middle housing, kind of these higher level middle housing types in areas near transit stations, near commercial corridors, near schools. The list would kind of go on, and a city would kind of build and build and build, grow like a balloon. The first approach, well, let me back up. That approach, while it sounds like it would kind of right size middle housing to the local context, presented a couple problems. And primary among those was, it was a static one-time look at how the city has currently to date been built out, and the land use patterns within the cities that have resulted in today's outcome. And it didn't really think about the future of the cities and how the city might change over time. So that was one. The second is, along with that, there's some issues about, maybe the land use patterns in cities, are less than ideal, less than optimal. There's some inequitable outcomes that result from maybe some of the land use policies that cities, not only across the state of Oregon, but just the US have implemented in the past. And so we felt that we shouldn't be perpetuating those types of decisions into the future. So we really kind of we saw that fork in the road and went the kind of left pattern, the whittle away approach, which is what the kind of presumptive approach is. And so that was the first kind of iteration of defining in areas. We basically said it's allowed basically everywhere except for where it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that would be goal protected areas. You can think of things like floodplains and steep slopes and areas near natural hazards and so on and so forth. The second was infrastructure constrained lands. So lands that have existing infrastructure, maybe there's a really small street or unpaved, or there's water quality issues, somewhere where we didn't want to kind of put more people into an infrastructure system that isn't quite up to capacity quite yet. So those were kind of the first two. And then we came up with a system that kind of gave cities the ability to refine that even further, kind of whittle away even more lands to kind of exempt those lands from higher level middle housing. But really what we found, and this was mostly thanks to lots of local government planners and elected officials at the local level, just saying, we have no certainty in that process, where if the department is saying a city can whittle away further, but the criteria through which we can either whittle away or think critically about where middle housing should be really just is super subjective. There's no clear criteria. It's basically just a judgment call on the department, and that doesn't give us any real comfort as we're going to our elected officials, to the public, on a vote for a development code that implements House Bill 2001. So we took that to heart, and certainly understood that we had been calling that flexibility, and that may not have been truly accurate once we put all the parameters around that process, even though we called it flexibility. And so it took a lot of work between the department and cities and housing advocates to kind of come up with this secondary approach, and which I'll talk about right now. So like I mentioned, in the medium-sized cities rules, the city can either go with the model code, right, the very specific set of standards, or they can kind of work within the minimum compliance standards. This is the flexibility, the floors and the ceilings, right? There's a range of standards there. And even within those range of standards, we heard that from quite a few cities that even those ranges weren't sufficient kind of flexibility, wiggle room, elbow room to right size the standards. And so we were trying to find this kind of alternative approach, we called it a third lever that a city can pull for a time, but ultimately what we landed on is more of a performance metric approach. And so that's what we're proposing as part of these rules. So if a city is saying, we've got standards, minimum compliance standards for minimum lot size or maximum density, we've got a very, very specific set of standards that you can apply to those middle housing types within those kind of two specific standards. And cities, local governments have been really advocating for being able to pick a minimum lot size that's different than what we've kind of proposed in our minimum compliance standards. And so a city, we've kind of given the opportunity for cities to do that, to pick their own minimum lot size, but there's a test that is associated with that to ensure that cities aren't, there's powers within the cities that kind of are protecting their neighborhoods or trying to be excluded from the process. And so we've kind of put these parameters around middle housing types. And so a city can say, we're going to apply a minimum lot size of 10,000 square feet to the development of a quadplex. And that's different from what the department said a city can actually regulate middle housing under. A city can certainly apply the standard of 10,000 square feet if they can show that they're allowing triplexes on at least 80% of the lots and parcels that are zoned residential that allow for the development of a single family detached home within their cities. And then for quadplexes, that performance standard is 70%, townhomes, that's 60%, cottage clusters, that's 50%. And so you can think of this as, we're gonna apply different standards to a certain point, and that's those metrics there. Does that make sense? That's a pretty key point in the process there. And I tried to explain that as clearly as I could.
We do have one hand up. It's for Council President Sherman.
Great.
Thank you. Ethan, just a quick question on this. So, Happy Valley is an area that's growing very rapidly. And so we're looking at dealing with a lot of new developments. And when we talk about these types of things, so does this preempt the metro density calculation? Does it contemplate it? How do these go hand in hand?
Yeah, so the density calculation is more of a planning for future housing need exercise. And then this is more about allowing housing types. And there is some interplay there, but there's another provision in House Bill 2001 that actually talks about how middle housing should actually be considered through the housing planning process. And it puts a cap on what a local government can assume the percentage of their housing need that'll be met by increased middle housing. So that was a really jumbled sentence, but basically as a city is planning their their 20-year planning or their housing need, they can only assume a 3% absorption of that housing need through middle housing. So that's how it's calculated.
Okay, so I guess then the question would be, and you kind of touched on this before, where, you know, certain lot sizes have to provide a certain level of triplexes, quadplexes, et cetera. So as we do the calculation then, I mean, if let's just say hypothetically you have a new PUD going into place, and I'm just going to make up numbers. The city decides that it's going to be a R10, it's going to be 10,000 square foot minimum lot sizes. As we do the calculation, if this area does contemplate that quads can be on 100% of those lots, then theoretically, that's 4 lots per acre, that's 16 units per acre, which easily satisfies the current metro designation. And I think I saw 15 dwelling units per acre residential density here. Does that, I mean, is that satisfactory? And so, I'm obviously a little bit confused on kind of the nuance, how those different pieces fall into play and how the calculation works, and that theoretically it's the maximum number of units that are allowed multiplied by the area, whether those units are executed or not.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and one that we tried to make a carve out for understanding that those, especially in a planned unit development or a master plan community, those kind of new areas that are added to a UGB or, you know, being subdivided into a certain, you know, a new neighborhood within a city. And so we tried to think a little bit about, you know, the intent of House Bill 2001 is really to provide a housing mix. It's not to have a, you know, 1,000 unit or 1,000 townhome unit subdivision, right? And so those new communities, those master plan communities, need to really have a mix of residential housing types, you know, something that'll make sense for the neighborhood. And so we've got these provisions in here about master plan communities, and, you know, you mentioned the 15 units per acre. We're kind of just saying the city isn't really on the hook for allowing a quadplex on every single lot in a master plan community, because that would completely blow out the infrastructure calculations and assumptions that you're going to be doing. So the city can be more specific about what types of housing, middle housing types would be allowed in that, and they can work with the developer about, you know, our master plan is going to look like this, and we don't anticipate a quadplex to be built on every lot and parcel. And so we're kind of just saying, you know, it doesn't necessarily apply to those master plan communities so long as you have a minimum density, residential density of 15 units an acre in those places. So I hope I answered that question.
You did, thank you. I mean, I think that's, you know, for our areas, because of our zoning codes, we already allow multifamily of very many types within most of our zoning. You know, really more impactful for a city like Happy Valley is more the reduced parking requirements and things like that, given that we have no transportation in the area. It's very impactful for our infrastructure. So that's probably the biggest thing that we're trying to work through as we look at this new process. Sure. Thank you. You answered my question.
Yeah, thanks for the
I have
question.
another question teed up for Commissioner Savis.
Yeah, as I'm looking at this paragraph, what came to mind when I saw the master plan communities was my question about, you know, the deliberate intention of modern day homeowners associations, CC&Rs, where, you know, there's no on-street parking for RVs, for example, and in the neighborhood, you know, the lots, there's on-site parking, you know, or driveway, garage, whatnot. There's all these rules and rules and covenants for how people take care of their properties and so forth. What's going to happen to those particular design communities? Because they often at times, in a sense, I believe, probably pay a premium for having a large park that is part of that facility or that development in these large, you know, well-developed properties, housing developments, what's going to happen to those? Is there any obligation to the people who are still paying mortgages on that what they paid for is long gone, or help me out with that?
Yeah, so thankfully the rules, well, I guess I will back up a little bit. So CC&Rs are, of course, private agreements between property owners, and the state really has no authority to meddle in those discussions. And so those kind of existing master plan communities that have the neighborhoods, those CC&Rs about RVs, and you've got all of this private or public open space that's kind of shared throughout the community. Any of those existing CC&Rs, won't really be changed by House Bill 2001, mostly because the allowance for middle housing is really tied to areas that are zoned residentially and allow for the development of a single-family detached home. So in a master plan community where there's, they've kind of got this easement for a shared open space, that's not going to be kind of opened up for middle housing development. Of course, there is always the opportunity or the potential for your neighbor or you to build a middle housing type on your lot. So there may be some distaste for that in those communities, and I don't think that there's a whole lot of worry about kind of a quadplex on every lot kind of popping up overnight. I think it'll be more of a long-term, kind of 50-year change rather than a 3-month or even a 3-year change.
I have another question, and if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to get us back to seeing everyone's faces while we have some questions here. Councilor Heisey, you have the floor.
Thanks, Trent. So I just want to make sure I understand this, because this has come up. A lot of Milwaukee is entirely built out, and a lot of what was built in the 50s and 60s, and we're discovering that there are pretty large neighborhoods that were developed by certain developers, and they have in the CC&Rs spelled out that there can only be one residence per lot. A lot of restrictions that would, if someone decided, limit our ability to put ADUs or would affect redevelopment. So you're saying that that's not changing?
Right. So House Bill 2001 did have a provision in it about new CC&Rs that would limit the number of units on a lot, specifically related to middle housing. However, existing CC&Rs, there's no retroactive change to those. Those are contracts between property owners that there's no way to go back. However, there are some of those CC&Rs have, since been voided or out of date or need updating. Any of those updates to those CC&Rs would also fall under that kind of new category. So would not be able to be either kind of updated, reinforced, so on and so forth.
Okay. And deed restrictions are similar?
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
I think that's the place where we have the most.
Right. I think I can pull up the bill, but I think that exact language is a recorded instrument.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
No additional questions at this time.
Right. Stealing the share back. All right. So just one other kind of little piece here about the in areas. There's also, sorry, I lost my place. Where are we? Right there. Okay. One little additional nuance here. So this is this F, which is really kind of our attempt at getting to the equitable distribution of middle housing across cities so that we're not creating these pockets of still exclusionary single family zoning, because there is that wiggle room. There is that 20% that would potentially have no middle housing allowed on their lots. So we're kind of throwing this other piece in here about cities should ensure that at least one middle housing type other than a duplex, of course, duplexes on every lot and parcel, 75% of the residential lots within a census block group. And I know that's a really kind of funky term. It's a geographic area that's constructed by the US Census. It averages about 600 to 3,000 residents. 75% of those lots within the census block group should allow at least one middle housing type. So that's a triplex, quadplex, townhome, or cottage cluster. That'll kind of help spread that across the jurisdictions, so we're not getting these pockets. All right. So that's, I think, quite a bit about in areas. It kind of pops up in one or two other places of the draft rules, the proposed rules, and we'll touch on that as we get to them. But for now, I think we can kind of put that one to rest and focus on some of the specific siting standards. So I'm going to kind of scroll through here. These are just pretty boilerplate language pieces here. This section talks about middle housing is subject to the same approval and review process as single family detached homes in the same zone. So you wouldn't be able to, a city wouldn't be able to kind of force a quadplex to go through some sort of design review if a single family detached home also is also subject, or is not also subject to that design review. All right. So onto the siting and design standards. This section gets really kind of detailed here, but from a higher level, we're looking at these numbers. The numbers speak to the specific housing, middle housing type. So 2 is related to triplexes and quadplexes. You'll see 3 is related to townhomes. So all of these letters here are the standards related to triplexes and quadplexes. Like I mentioned in the in areas conversation, really there's 2 standards that are kind of the sticking points and really come into play when we even begin to broach the subject of unreasonable cost and delay. And that first one is minimum lot size. The feasibility analysis for this project that we've conducted with consultants really showed that the feasibility for a triplex really tips at 5,000 square feet. Mostly that's due to the availability of lots in our cities that would really work well for this type of development. So we've kind of broken this apart into 2 different pieces. So if a city is requiring a smaller minimum lot size for a single family detached home, the minimum lot size for a triplex can be 5,000 square feet, but it cannot be greater than 5,000 square feet. And then if a city requires a minimum lot size of greater than 5,000 square feet, there's some zones in our cities that require a 10,000 square foot minimum lot size for a single family detached home. That same standard would apply to triplexes. You're not kind of like going backwards, going smaller just for triplexes. So that's kind of the structure that we're setting that up under. For triplexes, that's 5,000 square feet. That's the cutoff. For quadplexes, that cutoff is at 7,000 square feet. And then the other kind of key consideration when it comes to feasibility is maximum density standards. So lots of cities regulate residential units, I guess, by maximum density requirements. And House Bill 2001 really is a paradigm shift in that type of regulation. If you're allowing a duplex on every lot and parcel, and you have a maximum density that only allows a single family detached home on those lots within an acre, then that standard really doesn't work, because you're suppressing the amount of units that are allowed or feasible within that development. So maximum density standards really through House Bill 2001 kind of go to the wayside a little bit. And we've kind of called that out in the minimum lots, or in the minimum requirements, minimum compliance standards, sorry. So we say if a city applies maximum density standards in the zone, they do not apply to the development of quadplexes and triplexes. You'll see in parking very similar standard with a little bit of nuance here for as you see in the duplex, but for triplexes, ultimately it's 1 space per unit in the triplex, so a total of 3, but we've tiered that to the lot size. So if it's on a smaller lot, the city can only require a smaller number of parking spaces, because the amount of parking spaces that you're requiring for a development really have an impact on the feasibility of that development. So we're tiering it by the actual lot size. Again, this is not the minimum lot size, it's the actual lot size.
Ethan, I want to do a quick time check here. We're getting close to an hour into the meeting, and I want to make sure that there's time for discussion for this group here at the end of your presentation. So just want to do a time check real quick.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So I won't go, I think I'm probably boring everybody with all these details, so I'll kind of skip through these a little bit quicker. For quadplexes, again, kind of the running theme here is 1 space per unit for all of the middle housing types. I'm going to skip down into townhomes. The minimum lot size requirement for townhomes is a little difficult because you can imagine on these interior lots where there's a townhome, you don't need all of the setbacks on the sides because the building is right on the property line. So those interior lots are usually smaller, and the corner lots or the end of the townhome development, those lots are usually larger because there's a side setback or there's parking there or it's on a corner or something like that. So we want an average approach, an average minimum lot size approach, as opposed to a really fixed approach there. And this standard really works in tandem with the density standard. So we understand that townhomes is one of those development types that can kind of completely explode a neighborhood if you've got a row of single-family detached homes, and all of a sudden it transitions into a block of townhomes, and that transition is really stark and really sharp. And so to kind of read that, we've put this density standard here to say if a city applies maximum densities in the zone to townhomes, they can kind of put a multiplier of that of 4 times the maximum density, or 25 units an acre, whichever is less. So kind of giving some more compatibility within existing neighborhoods to the townhome standards. Again, parking 1 space per unit. Pretty standard. You can't really split that up because the units are on individual lots. For cottage clusters, this is a really tricky one because cottage clusters, I think, are a development that lots of cities have been trying to kind of chase for a while and haven't been able to do very well. I know there's a couple examples across the state. Bend and Milwaukee come to mind of kind of are the kind of gold star for cottage cluster development standards in the state. And so we've kind of borrowed heavily from those, or at least tried to adapt those to the statewide context the best we could. We've put a very similar minimum lot size standard to cottage clusters that we did for tris and quads. So kind of pegging that at 7,000 square feet minimum lot size. There was lots of discussion at the rack and the TAC level about should the state try to create these standards such that cities can allow cottages on individual lots and parcels within the cottage cluster development to really facilitate home ownership, easy transfer of those properties. Again, that really opened up a can of worms and really pointed to the fact that that's more of a legislative fix, and going through that process is painstaking, and it would require probably another 13 pages added to the document. So, okay, that's a lot there. I think for the purposes of time, this is all the detail we really need to go in today. Of course, I could go on for hours and hours, and as Martha knows, we do in those RAC meetings. They're usually 4-hour meetings, so there's plenty of things to talk to. So happy to answer any questions. If you have any questions that you've wanted to kind of think about after the meeting, please feel free to send me an email. You can send it to housing.dlcd at state.or.us. Again, housing.dlcd.
Ethan, if you could put that email in the chat, that would be helpful.
Oh, yeah. That's
I
smart.
do have a question from Councillor Lee, who was wanting to wait until after your presentation, and then following Councillor Lee, I have Council President Sherman.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. That was understandable, actually. I was wondering if there's any difference in the application of the law if it's in a historic zone like Laurelhurst.
Right. So we talk about the goal protected areas and how there's maybe some conflict between allowing these middle housing types and those types of areas. So there is a specific call out about historic resources, historic districts within the proposed rules. And really what that boils down to is the standards. A city can apply standards to those middle housing types within kind of the building envelope that's allowed within that district. So, it's not kind of deteriorating that resource. So internal conversions and all of that kind of stuff would still be allowed, but the city can apply, I guess, more restrictive standards than what they would typically allow in that zone to the middle housing.
Thank you. Council President Sherman, followed by Mayor Axelrod.
Great, thanks, Trent. Ethan, one question. So I know in the documentation there was some phrasing about you couldn't allow excessive fees or time to delay the process or something in there about that. And I guess, can you elaborate on that to touch? The reason I asked that question is, being an area, a growing area, our SDCs are quite a bit higher than other areas that are built out. And so one could argue that applying an SDC that typically goes for what is the normal 3,000 square foot home in a developing suburb applied to a quad could be deemed excessive, even though it's absolutely a requirement because we're starting with raw ground. Who determines that, and how would that apply?
Right. Yeah. So actually, the bill basically writes that out of consideration for the department and out of consideration for the model code and minimum compliance standards. They speak to siting and design standards that cause unreasonable cost and delay. So SDCs, utility connections, on street improvements, all of that kind of stuff are outside of the purview of that unreasonable cost and delay.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Mayor Axelrod.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Ethan. I'm usually a fairly detail-oriented kind of person, but I'm kind of just worried about the complexity and who's going to really understand this stuff and how are they going to interpret it. I guess I have my sense is it's kind of overwhelming and it's kind of seems kind of complicated. I said others seem to find that maybe all easily understandable, but anyway, I'm concerned about the complexity. One of my questions has to do with sort of getting kind of with the area standards and locational things. And for cities like ours, that large portions of our city are not served at all by transit, we're concerned about that. And we'd like to put this kind of housing where we have transit. And so, we're hoping that there's going to be flexibility about some of these locational elements. Can you comment on that at all? I didn't see that reflected in any of the items you touched on.
Yeah, so one of the key considerations as we're going through the rulemaking process is, how we define those areas and where this is actually applicable and how cities would regulate these types of, where and how big and all sorts of things about middle housing. And so when I was describing this kind of that fork in the road about the balloon approach where we start at zero and kind of get particular about where middle housing should be allowed, or the whittle away approach where we kind of take a presumptive approach, it's allowed everywhere except that you're getting smaller. You start big, get smaller, or you start small and get bigger. The approach where you start small and get bigger, really, I feel like there was a lot of kind of pushback to that approach, because those areas, where transit stations are, provided, where transit routes kind of land in our geography, really can change over time. And then at the same time, as those transportation systems are being planned, they really focus on where they can serve the most people. And so if we kind of go this balloon approach, we're really just kind of doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on the past land use decisions that were made and the land use patterns within our cities today. And we understand that those processes have led us to the need for House Bill 2001. And we didn't want to perpetuate those types of those decisions in the future. So we went the route where it's kind of allowed generally across the city, except for where it really, really doesn't make sense, and infrastructure constrained areas, gold protected, floodplains and that kind of stuff. And then kind of opening up the opportunity for cities to go a little bit further. But I understand your
infrastructure constraint.
I'm sorry?
So transit isn't really an infrastructure constraint from your perspective.
Transit is. It's more the transportation network. So in the rulemaking process, we kind of used this example from Albany about this kind of bridge. They have a bridge that separates North Albany from Albany downtown in the core. And what do we do in an instance where the city of Albany wants to exclude the portions of North Albany from middle housing because they've got this bridge problem? And so kind of looking at that, we were saying, well, that is an infrastructure constraint that can't really be remedied through, just planning for growth. And so we're looking at the system generally, rather than, a transit stop is not within a half a mile of this area, and therefore we're not going to allow middle housing.
Councilor Morrison.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. So two things. Number one, your comment on I'm concerned. Tualatin has 2 census tracts that are very well served by public transportation. As a matter of fact, we have a development that hopefully, as it moves forward, contains some of these elements. It literally would be at a bus stop on a route that is one of the only one in Tualatin that's served, Monday through Friday all day long, and they're about to expand it 7 days a week. Perfect place. But we have 2 tracks that have no public transportation whatsoever, and this type of development would be an absolute disaster. Now, the development can't really happen because there's no place to development unless, and this is my second part of my question, with an HOA in Tualatin, I don't know the official number. I've heard that it's roughly 70% of homes in Tualatin are HOA. I think that's a little high, but I know down in the south part of Tualatin, around Ibeck Park, everything is an HOA. Around Bridgeport Elementary, everything is an HOA. So if those HOAs were to make a minor change to their CCNRs, would that invalidate then all of their CCNRs, prohibiting any, and I believe these are all blanket, by the way, CCNRs that prohibit any type of outside development to your structure?
That's a good question. I don't know the extent of the amendments that would need to be made to kind of trigger that. I would have to ask the Department of Justice folks that are working on our team just about what that actual trigger is. I don't know if it's just any amendment, but it's a good question. I don't, unfortunately, don't know the answer.
Yeah, typically an HOA, number one, it's extremely difficult to make any changes anyway. They universally call for 2/3 vote, and you can barely. I live in an HOA. We have 79 units, and luckily the bar for elections is 10 units, and we twice not made it in the 10 years I've been here. So a lot of those minor things like such as that, and I would be concerned about the property owners and trying to make a minor change.
Yeah, so I'm looking at House Bill 2001 right here, and that specific provision states that provision in a recorded instrument affecting real property is not enforceable if, and it goes on to describe, but the second provision there, the instrument was executed on or after the effective date of this 2019 bill. So executed has got a very legalistic sounding definition. So I'll have to look into how our DOJ folks are reading into that executed.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I have a follow-up question for Tom Montcraft.
Thanks, Ethan. At TriMet, we've spent about a year working on new plans for transit-oriented development. And I really appreciate what Member Axelrod talked about. But you don't specifically call out transit-oriented development.
We do not. That's correct.
And is there a reason why you didn't, or you just, it didn't really probably apply to a lot of cities, but.
Well, I think it is, while we don't say it explicitly, I think the underlying impact of the approach that we've taken really says it's going to, middle housing should be allowed pretty much everywhere, 80, 70, 60, 50% of your city. And so we think that captures it pretty well. And especially in the instance where a city wants to go kind of that performance metric route, it's not a locational determination. It's more of a lot characteristic determination. And so by really limiting it in a locational aspect, we get almost too specific in defining where middle housing should go. And so we've said it's larger than that. And, transit-oriented development is kind of captured within that definition. It's a subset of that 60-50.
I currently see no other questions.
Wow, easy as that, huh? All right.
Easy as that. Ethan, this has been a topic of many questions over the last few months. And so I know this is a topic of interest for everybody in here. A lot of information here. These are recorded, of course. For anyone who wants to go back and listen to, we'll probably have it posted early to middle of next week. Okay. Enjoy your Labor Day, of course. So if someone else has a follow-up question to any of that email that you provided in the chat room is a good place to reach you?
Yes, it's, well, yes. And I'm going to put actually in the chat as well my personal email. That the housing.dlcd email address is kind of the catch-all for, I guess we'll call it kind of public comment. And so we've been capturing the comments that come into the housing.dlcd email address and kind of providing them to the RACs and the TACs and then to our commission. But if you have like a very specific question that you maybe don't want to go to the larger group, then feel free to email me personally.
And by personal email, we of course mean his DLCD email at state.or.us. Yes. Mr. Gornick, you have.
Are these draft OARs, are they available on the DLCD website?
They will be shortly. It's a little funky because we just posted the Secretary of State posting on the 1st. And so they're in a really jumbled format through the Secretary of State website. But we're getting that kind of more easily readable document up on our website.
Would it be helpful to like send a copy of the PDF to Trent and he can distribute it to everybody in C4?
Yes, it'll come out as part of our Land Conservation Development Commission packets on September 10th.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'll be sure to send that over to Trent. And Trent, if it's okay with you, I can try to look into Paul's question and try to get back to you and him through Trent, if that works.
That's great.
Okay.
Frequently we have questions that require some follow-up emails, and so once you have that question, just send that with the PDF at the same time, and I can distribute.
Great. And if I could steal maybe 10 more seconds of folks' time, if that's okay with you, Trent.
Okay. I don't lead these meetings, I facilitate them.
Okay, all right.
Take it away.
Oh, great. So I just wanted to kind of follow up on next steps. So like I mentioned, we've got our Land Conservation Development Commission first public hearing on these proposed rules for large cities, September 25th. It's in the morning, about 9 a.m. I think is when we're scheduled to discuss it. If you have comments that you would like to provide for the commission to review, please send those to the housing.dlcd email address by September 21st. We send out the comments that we receive between when the packets go out and before the meeting, just a couple days so the commission's got a chance. And if you also want to provide verbal testimony at the meeting, you can sign up. It's a Zoom meeting, of course. You can sign up on the DLCD website. The public hearing will be held open, like I mentioned, until November 12th and 13th, where the commission will hopefully adopt those rules, and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much. Mayor Hodson, would you like to transition us?
I sure will. Pardon the no camera. I'm having technical difficulties, so you'll just have to stare at a blank screen, so I apologize for that. Ethan, thank you for the presentation. Appreciate it. There's a tremendous amount of detail.
So much.
To these rules and whatnot. And I know in Canby we haven't talked much about it yet, and I know our planning department will be busy figuring out how to apply all of this to our standards. So thanks for the update and laying that out. Next on the agenda is the letter to the Oregon Transportation Commission, pardon me. I think it's there in your packet, and I think Trent will pull it up on the screen. Yes, Trent?
I can do that.
Perfect. So hopefully you've all had a chance to read the letter. I will say a couple of comments, and then you can read it quickly and we can discuss it. It was interesting that this was tonight's topic because last night, Linda Broussard and her team did a presentation to the city of Canby on the tolling program, and what came up a couple of times in the conversation was, in fact, this very topic of how once the infrastructure of putting the tolling gantries in, the construction of the added lane on 205 or lanes on 205, once those were paid off from the tolling aspect, then anything residual from that was left over would then go to projects that the funds would remain in the project areas for us to use as for projects, which was interesting because that was, I'd heard differently that the tolling wasn't going to be used, tolling dollars was not going to be used for the actual build out of the lanes, but sounds like that is the case. So I think this letter calling on the OTC to make sure that the funds that are generated within the 205 corridor stay in that tolling area to help with diversion projects that will undoubtedly need to be addressed with this implementation, I think is an important piece. So hopefully everyone is in agreement and that we can move this on to OTC for their upcoming meeting, which I think is later this month. Is it not, Trent?
Thank you, Mayor Hodson. Yes, just want to affirm much of what you just said, all very accurate. The next OTC meeting, I believe, is September 17th. So the timing is good for this question. And this question did come specifically from the OTC, wanting to know more about this question after a conversation with the ODOT leadership, Brendan Finn in particular. So, you know, they are reaching out to want to know more about, you know, where will these revenues be spent? And the phrase they use, I'll just add to this commentary, the phrase they use is the project corridor or the tolling corridor. And so for us, that would be the I-205 area. But I think a lot of staff and our stakeholder group has had some heartburn around the phrase corridor. And so we've changed it to project area, knowing that the I-205 tolling project, you know, is specific to mile, you know, over there by the Stafford Road exit up to the 99 exit, and trying to remove some of the ambiguity of something that might be spent up closer towards Powell Boulevard or Division, et cetera. So staff felt like this would be a more appropriate way to emphasize that, you know, where the revenue is collected, that is where the projects should be seen. And so, yeah, the timing's good, and we kept it short because much of your comments have already been captured in the letter to the R1 Act. So, yeah, that would be what I would add.
So, question, Trent, and maybe there's those here in the group can answer this question as well. Do we know what the defined project area is? Like, is it, or the, you know, if we're sticking to 205, is it anything that has to do with road improvements and whatnot that are all of a sudden becoming more heavily used because of the tolling? Is it a certain bandwidth around the tolling area? Has that been discussed that we know of?
I don't work for ODOT answer is that the project is specific to what's told on I-205 and the on and off ramps. The project impact would probably have a greater area, and that would be probably where there's some discussion, where there's some gray area.
Okay, that's what I was afraid of. Even though that is a non-ODOT employee answer, that would have been my guess. Would have been we'd be looking at, you know, how far down Highway 99 into Canby will there be projects, or how far up 43 will funding reach to address projects along there or in those areas, or even, you know, yeah, 99 in McLaughlin in that direction into Milwaukee. Like, what, you know, is it? I suspect it'll probably be project by project.
I think that's really an important comment to make too. You know, just a reminder that we're still in the comment period for that for the NEPA alternatives. That ends in about a week or so. NC4 has already submitted that letter from last month. But what those comments do in a NEPA process and throughout the process of any project is it lays the foundation for, you know, what the expected impact is. And so now ODOT is starting to study what the diversion impacts are in different areas. And when they identify that information, now there's context to where, you know, context to what a project does or doesn't do because of the work of something like tolling. And so, you know, I think some of that is making the case for what funding could be spent on, like the impacts of diversion down the road, if funding were to be spent on diversion. Just a quick note that, you know, a lot of legislators feel like the funding from tolling will pay for the project, even though we've heard mixed results on that it could pay for the entire 205 project or not. So wanted to add that commentary. Commissioner Savas and then Mayor Axelrod.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one of the risks of having a very short letter is you don't put in the level of detail necessary to really call that out. Two things in particular I want to just point out. If we grab that letter and someone grabs that letter, someone could make the assumption that it sounds like C4 and the signers of this letter are saying, you know, we're good with tolling just under these conditions. So you're saying yes, but with these conditions. So I just want to make that perfectly clear. And the other thing that we're commingling in there without really realizing it, because again, lack of detail, is there's two different types of tolling. So are we suggesting that congestion pricing tolling and capacity building tolling, that we would write the letter the same for each? I'm just gonna throw those two things out there because I don't think we've clearly articulated that we're supportive or non-supportive. What we're saying here is by this letter is that the reader will assume that you're okay with tolling.
Thank you. Mayor Axelrod. You might be on mute.
Sorry, I was kind of looking back at the language there based on what Commissioner Savas just said. I'm not sure I'm not sure it actually says that about it, the tolling, but it could be. It says I think it says the concept, or so like we're okay with sort of the concepts, but any concept of tolling moving forward, you know, I think having a short letter that says it's our understanding that the dollars remain in that area, and it does refer to project area. you could add project area and project area impacts or something like that. You could add an area of impacts, but area might be okay. Generally, I thought it was okay, but I do think it's important that we keep that tolling concept element general, because we don't know exactly what the plan is or what may come forward yet. But anyway, it's just the general assumption that any concept that comes out should account for that, I think, is what we would prefer to emphasize.
Thank you very much. A few more hands being raised here, and I hope Ethan doesn't get jealous with all these questions coming our way. Mayor Hodson.
Thanks. To follow up on Commissioner Savis's comment, again, House Bill 2017 has tolling as a revenue stream. So as we've always been hearing, is that this is a foregone conclusion, at least at the state level, that this is going to happen. And so it's all about how we, as I've said in one of our diversion meetings, how we embrace and make this less sucky for people to deal with tolling, then and that this is the way it's going to be, and there's a whole lot we have to say about it. I mean, am I wrong in that understanding?
It's a fair point, Mayor Hodson. I mean, and that certainly is one of the challenges here, that ODOT is working at the direction of House Bill 2017. At the same time, there's a lot of political momentum to make the best out of what they're working on or not. And so I guess until there are gantries that are taking tolls, nothing's official. And so I think there's always room to make comments on how you'd like to see this project move forward or not, or make the best of it. That's how I think I would respond to that. Mayor Knapp?
Thank you. I share some of the concern Mr. Savas has expressed. We in Wilsonville have submitted a multi-page letter with very significantly more detail on the process. I think that there is a danger that not bringing up the full range of potential issues early on could work against us later on. From my point of view, I would like to see all the cities along the corridor submitting real detailed letter much more broadly than is addressed in this letter here. I don't know if it's overkill. I fear that not taking advantage while we have this opportunity will be detrimental at some point in the future. So we could share Wilsonville's letter, be happy to. It's already, I've signed it and it's gone, I think, already, but just a couple days ago. There's an awful lot of issues that I think need to be dealt with, and I think personally that it's going to take some legislative modification before we have a successful program. And I don't think we should throw up our hands and say, well, that's the way the legislature pitched it, so we're, I mean, we need to have dialogue about where there are deficiencies, where there are concerns, where there are unanticipated consequences, and push in a direction to correct all those things.
Thank you, Mayor Knapp. Happy to share that letter. I can work with Mr. Ottenon to move that around. And then I would say the reason this letter was drafted so specifically is because C4 did provide a robust comment to the NEPA process. And this letter from the OTC was much more specific, their question about this topic. So they are in some ways two different issues. This was the OTC trying to take the pulse of stakeholders on this question in particular. But that doesn't mean you can't expand our answer. Mr. Myers.
Thanks. First of all, I want to say, in thinking about this letter and the letter to ODOT, I kind of become a little incensed over the whole thing. And I think that it's important that this group feel a certain amount of that also. To step back to basics, we're talking about Clackamas County citizens funding a tolling project to see whether or not it's going to work, and then the possibility of this money being taken someplace else and used elsewhere. It's like insult on top of injury. So if I was to change this letter, it would make it more affirmative and more of an advocacy piece, because I think that's what the people that we're representing will want here. It's one thing to have us all pay for it. It's another thing to have it go outside of the area. And whether or it is project area or project impact, is anything here going to be binding on the state? We're talking about a potentially very large pot of money. Is it possible that this could lead, they could commit and do whatever they're going to do, and then 5 years hence find themselves sitting on top of millions of tolling dollars and say, well, we need them down in Marion County? Is there any way that we can get at a binding aspect of this? Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, to Mayor Hodson's original question that he raised here tonight, I don't think it's that clear in the 2017 legislation. I don't have it in front of me, but it's not that clear that it's a foregone conclusion that tolling along I-205 is going to happen. I think detail is important, and I think that every piece of correspondence we send in on something as complex as this, we ought to be reviewing all the other correspondence that we've had to make sure it's consistent and clear. For example, and I mentioned the two different types of tolling. We talked about diversion in the past. Last month, when we talked about my concern about ODOT presuming that the baseline for congestion pricing might be to regulate it at the current, and I'm gathering current meant pre-COVID level. So let's just say through West Lynn on Willamette Falls Drive down by where Councilor Lewis lives, if there was 3,000 cars a day coming out that are being diverted coming out Willamette Falls Drive between 4 o'clock in the evening, between 4 and 6 in the evening, that would be the baseline. And then we would build we would build the extra lane, which was intended to relieve that amount of flow, that diversion. But we would congestion price people off the road until we hit that 2,000 or 3,000 cars during that period of time. So this is so detailed. This is such a complex issue, and I think those details need to be spelled out. So we need to keep a log of everything we've written down, and keep in mind when we send correspondence that we articulate very carefully where we're coming from. Because remember, in that letter also says no toll, no build, and that is part of our recommendation, that there be a no build, no toll. So we can't presume that suddenly a month later that tolling is a foregone conclusion. I'm saying a few things here, but I'm not comfortable with the letter as it's crafted.
Got a few more comments, and then I think I can make a recommendation to perhaps improve the letter based on comments here. Councilor Lewis, have you next.
Thank you. I think with picking up on Commissioner Savas's note that there's several kinds of tolling, ODOT refuses to narrow down their goal of what they're trying to get out of tolling. It's going to be a package to pay for the expansion and the new lane. It's going to be a package that could potentially pay for diversion mitigation. It's going to be a package of tolling that could contain congestion pricing and price variability in order to change traffic habits. On top of that, the tolling has to pay for the infrastructure to collect the toll itself. So that's 4 different ways you can see the money being spent. In addition, when you look at an equity discount or some sort of equity lens for those of us who live right by 205 and have to interact with 205 just to get to the grocery store, that's a lot of different ways the money should be going that may be prioritized over paying for the infrastructure itself. Paying for the new infrastructure is something we should be asking of our next legislative session. But no matter what, we should make sure that the infrastructure has to be in place. And if that means we're paying back from the toll, so be it, but we're not waiting for tolling for our 205 improvements. And I think that's some of the nuance that the short letter doesn't contain.
Good points. Councilor Morrison.
Yeah, just, I know we're running out of time, but real quick, I just agree with what Commissioner Savas says, and now what our new mother, Councilor Lewis, has said. And I hope you're doing well, Lewis, by the way, and the baby's doing good. I haven't really heard anything. So just, I also want to follow up on Mayor Knapp's comment. The City of Tualatin sent a letter involving 11 points, and our letter is on the website, City of Tualatin's website. If other members of this group want it, we'll be happy to make arrangements to get it sent out to everybody. Personally, I think it would be nice if every city that has sent a letter, if we could somehow collate all those together. I would be interested, in the policy nerd that I am, would like to go over that. But just to follow up on Commissioner Savas's comments with the letter, this letter just really doesn't say anything. What I read out of it is that we support tolling, which I don't personally support tolling at all. No one from the City of Tualatin has gone on record as supporting tolling. So I think it does need some little tweaks. And to Councilor Lewis's comment about all the different things that are involved with that. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. Yes, please do send your letter in. I'm happy to collect everyone's letters to the NEPA process, or even this question to the OTC, and consolidate that and put it into one document for everyone's records. Happy to do that. We would love to track that internally here at the county as well anyway. So that's work that we would be happy to cover for everybody. So if you are submitting a letter, I do just want to reiterate, now is the time to comment on the NEPA alternatives process. So if your jurisdiction is thinking about it, please do so. I think the September 16th is the deadline, if I recall. So it's about a week and a half left to make that submission. Seeing no other hands, I am hearing that this letter needs to be updated. And so like we did with the NEPA letter, what I would propose is to give staff a little bit of time and then take it to the C4 Executive Committee, who meets next on September 14. That is still a few days in advance of the OTC meeting. So that would not be too late for them to look at a new version of the letter and approve it. Some of the comments that I heard that would be worth including in a revised letter include clarification around the definition of tolling, clarification around the definition of corridors versus project areas and what that means for diversion impacts, as well as the goal of tolling. And that was an addition that Councilor Lewis was describing with, is this a toll, is this a value pricing mechanism, etc. So if that is the direction of this membership, we can take that to the executive committee at their September 14 meeting.
Trent?
Mayor Axelrod.
Just real quick, should the context of the letter be more, should any tolling concept or approach move forward to address this? I do agree that the jury's out on whether tolling even is going to be implemented. The statement in the 2017 package, as I recall it, was very short, brief, and unspecific. And if the legislature is not going to expand on that further, which many of us have requested, then I think we do want the context of, should any concept move forward, and clearly indicating we're not necessarily endorsing tolling as a group, but should any concept move forward, this is just one of the expectations we have.
Thank you very much for saying that. That is one of my bullet points here. Not that this letter endorses or doesn't endorse tolling, but if in the event that tolling is to occur, that, the fast talking part at the end of a commercial, that's what this would say. Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, I just want to say, I don't mind your wrap up, Trent, but I wouldn't limit it to that. The other thing I'll add in here, and in the interest of time and making sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak and be heard tonight, I'm trying to limit my comments, but I just wanted to say that, again, we haven't mentioned the transit or lack of transit tonight, but I think that's a huge issue. Frankly, I think there ought to be a number of conditions that, and I like the wording that Mayor Axelrod kind of suggested, that should this move forward, should there be transit in place, should there be all these qualifiers to qualify that under these conditions, then we would support this or that concept beyond that point. But we need to qualify what we're saying.
I'm seeing head nods to that comment, Commissioner Savas.
I concur.
Well, I don't need a vote to take this to the executive committee. I see plenty of head nods, so a consensus there. So I think I have what I need at staff level. If you feel like you have language you'd like to recommend, feel welcome to email it to me and we can see, or just want to reiterate a comment. I'm happy to take an email as we begin working on this, probably on Tuesday, following Labor Day.
Great. Thank you, Trent. Appreciate that. Appreciate the dialogue. Next on the agenda is updates and other business. JPAC impact updates. Anything on that front? Mayor Knapp? No? Okay. You didn't have to lean forward to do that. I could have seen it from where you were at. That was okay. Anything on impact then? No takers. Okay. R1 Act update. I don't think we've got anything on that front, do we, Commissioner Savas?
No update. I believe there'll be executive committee meeting to set up the next meeting, but no news, no information at this time.
All right. And any other business? Mr. Morrison.
Yeah, real quick, for those, I think Trent, you sent out a reminder to everybody, for those who are interested in getting involved with this collective call to end violence, the deadline is tomorrow. Elizabeth Myers, the Chief of Staff for Washington County Chair Catherine Harrington, is coordinating everything. My understanding is there are an awful lot of signatures on there, and if interested in participating, get back tomorrow morning. My understanding is the entire city of Tualatin, along with multiple other counselors throughout the region, have all signed the letter. I've signed the letter.
Thank you. I would add, not everyone on the C4 membership would have received that email. It went strictly to elected officials in the region and the county. And so there are a few non-electeds on this group. So for those who might be curious what that is, it was a call to sign an elected leader's letter on the call to end violence. So it is what it is, but just wanted to make sure that for those who didn't receive the email, that it wasn't confusing.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. All right. I'm not seeing anybody else jumping up and down to provide any other business. So I will say that we are done for the evening and I will issue this meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a great holiday weekend. Be safe. Keep social distancing in mind and wear your masks. All right. Okay. See everyone next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.